Sweet. So again, yeah, thank you so much everyone for coming. The basic kind of intention of this session is giving people a general overview of how you could evaluate a national AI policy or just a set of legislations which any government across the world has released, and kind of trying to also do a comparison between them, which is what the AI and democratic values report does, which I will quickly now give you a overview of. Yeah, so this is like basically a report which is done every year by the Center for AI and Digital Policies in 2020. We have been increasing the number of countries every year. The idea is um, what kind of AI policies are being developed, comparing them and seeing like whether they can safeguard human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. I have been involved with the Center for AI and Digital Policy for about a year, and I have been also one of the contributors to the most recent edition. And yeah, I'm like super excited to be here and just give people a better sense of what's happening globally, because one of the concerns is, everything is so Western centric, and we are like just kind of building these silos around very specific countries and then what they are doing, that we're kind of forgetting what can the global citizenry do, or what kind of things are coming up which might inspire other legislative bodies to take up action and potentially even like kind of build consensus towards an international AI treaty if that's something we want. Um, so here's the set of metrics we used to like rank each country's policy work. There were about 80 countries in the report. I'll be giving you an overview of about 3 countries and then just a general overview of what's happening in the space as a whole. I do understand that a lot of these metrics have um, firstly a very overwhelming. It's a very dense slide, so I just very quickly pull out only these metrics to talk about, because they are the ones which we have seen countries falter the most on. So the first one talks about like the OECD AI principles, which I'll be just elaborating on in a bit. And this metric, which is number 8, is essentially almost every country in the world has like some sort of national AI policy strategy, because every country wants to cash in on using AI for their economies, but also like uh, you know trying to protect data of its citizens, protect fundamental services within the government if they're using AI, and just kind of mitigate AI risks. So this was a very important metric for us, that did the country in question actually put in measures of fairness, measures for accountability, mentioned things like transparency, safeguarding rule of law, and mentioning like safeguarding for human rights, or just a potential threat to human rights. And the next one is also like in a very similar breadth, that has a country even established a right to algorithmic transparency, so that the users can understand what is going on within the black box, or within like uh, the explainability or the responsible mechanisms for AI systems by AI service providers. I'll be talking very briefly about the UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of AI. And number 12 is one of the newer metrics, or like one of our updated metrics, which talks about has the country endorsed something called the Global Partnership on AI's Resolution and AI and Ethics, which there was the most recent resolution was actually just last year. And these is generally form the cornerstones for us to evaluate any country. The general marking we adopted was countries either get a yes, so they have endorsed these recommendations, they have implemented the recommendations, so they get a 1 point for that specific metric. If the answer to that question is no, then they get a 0. And if there's like uh, sort of partially endorsing, or like, okay, there's like partially endorsing, like partial implementation, or there's reason to believe that um, uh, there's some degree of independency, for example, in metric 7. So the country in question gets a 0.5. So that's essentially the setting up of the metrics. So quickly jumping on to the specific kind of principles. So a little bit on the UNESCO AI ethics recommendations is that it was launched in 2018, and about 193 countries, which is like all other countries of the UN, endorsed it and signed it. So the policy recommendations in it are relatively very broad, which might actually explain why so many countries have signed on to it. It does delve into a very multifaceted approach to the ethics of AI, right? So it goes all the way from, oh, how can AI be used in education, and how can we safeguard risks in education, to talking about gender bias, to talking about inclusivity, digital divide. It's a little bit broader than what you would expect, um, like policy recommendations to be. And that's because this is primarily intended as a rights-based approach, primarily intended as building a kind of a precedent for governments and citizenry to um, work towards developing more specific policy recommendations. So this is about it for the UNESCO AI ethics recommendations. Um, Quickly going into the OECD AI recommendation. So the idea here is making specific guidelines, and in general, these are much more targeted towards mitigating harms from AI, talking a lot about algorithmic transparency, data issues, making sure that we have some sort of an incident monitor, and that we understand what kind of standards are needed. Um, all of the G20 countries have signed on to this OECD AI principles, and now that the AU is also a part of the G20, they have also implicitly signed on to the OECD AI principles. The OECD in general is a grouping, I believe, of about 38 countries. And yeah, they are doing a lot of work in the space of like sandboxes and incident monitoring, which you can like look up, or also be happy to provide those resources. So those are like the two broad sort of pillars we have been looking at in terms of policy framework development. One of the main criticisms I often get is, oh, these principles are too broad, or they hold like little value. And I think the general response to that is building any kind of international regulation, or even like encouraging countries to develop their own recommendations. Um, these kind of frameworks, they act as good precedents, they act as good starting points. They end up shaping the narrative of the conversation, whether you like it or you don't like it. There's a lot of concerns about um, them not being specific enough, and I myself maybe have some of those things, but I feel a lot of them are also like to build the right amount of consensus. Like we see that the 193 countries have signed on to the AI recommendations by UNESCO. You can also like kind of think of this as civil society organizations or NGOs or AI safety researchers might want to hold these countries accountable to the fact that they have signed on to these principles, and which could make its own set of precedents, nationally speaking. So quickly jumping to specific countries, and one of the first countries I wanted to kind of talk about was Colombia, and part of the reason why I also picked Colombia is because they rank pretty highly in our metrics. They are a tier one country, and I'll quickly jump into like what tiers are, and they truly are like seem like the trailblazers right now in the Latin American region for what they are doing. For one thing, the constitution has a right to data protection, and they have a very, very good set of comprehensive data protection laws. Very recently, at the end of 23, a couple of Colombian senators also talked about further strengthening those data protection laws in light of ChatGPT. Colombia's data protection agency has also launched an investigation into ChatGPT over explainability issues about how it processes user data and responses by the model. So that's quite a first for Latin America. Um, One reason for concern potentially for Colombia is that there is a lot of use of AI to process court cases, as in to read over briefs and to, for example, summarize them. They have a system, I believe it's pronounced Prostea, to do this, and the court system has generally received a lot of flack for using an AI to almost act as some sort of a gatekeeper, or potentially there might be some sort of issues of bias. Colombia has also been a part of the regional council for the implementation of the UNESCO recommendation, and this has been partly due to its work for in something called the Santiago Declaration. For those of you who don't know, Santiago is the capital of Chile, and it last year hosted a pretty influential summit where Latin American countries got together and discussed the risks of AI, and just try to contextualize the UNESCO AI recommendations and ethics to Latin American context, and just their legal frameworks. So it was one of the leaders towards that declaration, and it is also like part of the regional council, which does a lot in terms of tracking implementation of these recommendations, since all countries in Latin America have also signed on to the UNESCO AI ethics, and just generally coming up with this framework of what can countries do better, what are countries doing right now, so acting as a sort of monitor. They've also developed like various policy intelligence tools. They have been supporting, the AI principles by the OECD as well, and yeah, generally just acting as um, a point of contact within the Latin American system. There has been more concerns coming up in Colombia recently. I was just looking into it over the afternoon, and it turns out there's like facial cameras everywhere at the major airport in Bogota, which tends to also raise a lot of issues because the way the data is processed, or the what is it exactly used for, is not been informed by the authorities, and there have been apparently calls by civil society organizations to talk more about that, but the government has generally kept uh, a pretty nonchalant approach towards it. There's also something called the Belin Communique, which is essentially a bunch of Latin American countries again banding together and urging the world to pass some sort of regulation on the use of AI in autonomous weapon systems. Colombia's minister has actually termed it as one of the most urgent negotiations which are pending at an international stage. And Colombia also recently launched a 2024 AI roadmap, where it talks a lot about how AI can be used for good, how AI can be used to boost its economy, while also like keeping a pretty watchful eye on how data is specifically used, because that is one of the tenets in the constitution. Okay, so quickly moving on towards China, actually, and China is a little bit odd in the sense that it has a very undue influence on AI conversations across the globe. Some of the up and coming labs, the largest up and coming labs, are coming out of China. There's a lot of Chinese tech giants which also want to get into the scene pretty quickly. But at the same time, it must be noted that the Chinese government also wants to get in on the regulation action. Most prominently, China has suggested this thing called like Global AI Governance Initiative, where it invites a lot of countries to develop standards together, particularly the Belt and Road Initiative countries. And it kind of has been touting an ethics first approach at discussions in the United Nations or at AI safety summits, which it also has been a part of, both the UK and the South Korean AI safety summits. This being said, there's obviously like a lot of fair degree of concern, because China has had a little bit of a history with how it deals with minorities and how it protects the data or the information of its citizens. China did launch a pretty um, wide range of data protection and data security laws. There's this one called the Personal Information Protection Law, which specifically talks about how public security is important. And one of the articles specifically talks about that data and information must be used to safeguard public security, which has been a cause for concern for many human rights organizations, particularly on how again they use these data to persecute minorities potentially. And there's also Article 40 of the same law, which goes goes on to say that different streams of data can be established with any kind of tech companies which operate in China. So that potentially again opens a lot of backdoors for the Chinese Politburo to take data from tech giants. There's also, to its credit, there's a lot of deep fake regulations which China has been doing. They have mandated that videos be watermarked if they're generated by AI. If any content is generated by AI, it be watermarked. They have also passed a whole host of algorithmic auditing requirements for tech giants, specifically pointing out that they have to, tech companies or tech labs have to submit algorithmic security self-assessment reports. And the Cyberspace Administration of China has also mandated, guidelines for how these algorithms have to be managed, how they have to be processed. And quite recently, China has also launched a very ambitious plan for becoming the AI superpower by 2030, which again shows how much these countries want to get in on the action in artificial intelligence and how transformative they view it as being. Yeah, and this is a final point with China. Their stance on lethal autonomous weapon systems, which is LAWS, has been fairly interesting, and its own kind of cause for concern. They have supported on multiple different forums a call to regulation for autonomous weapon systems, with the caveat that countries have to agree on the definition and the scope of these autonomous weapon systems, and China has been pretty vocal at the United Nations Office for Disarmament as well, which has been convening some meetings on this, on regulations being too broad at times, and the countries having conflicting definitions. So that has been viewed by some organizations in this space as being a stalling tactic, and it has been viewed by other organizations as a general endorsement for some kind of regulation on LAWS, but potentially that China does not want too much international interference in its own military industrial complex. Okay, so quickly moving on to the Netherlands, which is also one of the leading countries in our report, ranking in tier 1, if I remember correctly, scoring about 10.5 out of 12. And to their credit, the Netherlands has been expanding algorithmic transparency. It has developed a public registry for AI models and AI service providers. At first, the city of Amsterdam had its own registry, and later the national government just used the same model to make a public registry for the whole of the Netherlands. There's a set of very interesting supervisory body for algorithms coming up, which the EU has also been coordinating on an EU AI Act level basis. The Dutch government has been one of the most vocal in terms of implementation of GDPR and implementation of norms of the Digital Services Act, funneling into the broader EU AI Act legislation. And they've also, to their credit, made this whole coordination of algorithmic oversight within their data protection authorities. They were, I believe, the first, or at least one of the very early movers in the European Union to actually start making those bodies, which the EU AI also mandates. They have also launched a set of global commission on responsible AI in the military domain. So this is a very prominent international forum for deliberating on use of technology in the military domains, which Netherlands has been pretty vocal on, and they have been again using their kind of position within the European Union to also act as a point of contact for countries like China who want to also attend such forums and hold these kind of global discussions on autonomous weapon systems. As a final point, the Dutch judiciary has uh, very recently criticized quite severely the use of so-called secret algorithms in government services by saying something on the lines of that these kinds of AI system secret algorithms that are unexplainable is just to further government interests and completely isolates citizen interests. And they actually struck the use of those secret algorithms in the Dutch government's framework, which I believe were used um, for different kinds of like data flagging. Uh, just using personally identifiable information of Dutch citizens. So yeah, that is really it for like the little overview or
Do you mind if
giving
I ask
people a
a
little taste.
clarifying question?
Sure.
So, quick clarification, the secret algorithms, did they end up negating a very specific set of algorithms like that were being used, or was it a more general ruling against the concept of keeping their algorithms that are not neural network based secret? Like how general was that ruling?
It was not general, but there might be precedents for that to happen because the the specific court in the Netherlands cited the DMA or the DSA, the Digital Services Act of the European Union and the GDPR. And there were specific algorithms brought into question by certain civil society organizations. So yeah, it was definitely not intended as a general thing, but it might have specific precedents for that to happen in the future. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Oh yeah. So now that we have given you a taste of how we have been analyzing these um, countries and what they've been doing in the AI policy world, here's an overview of that set of 12 metrics being applied across the world. Um, let me just quickly explain the tier system. So tiers 1 to 5 is how we have bifurcated it. Tier 1 is essentially countries which have scored 10.5 and above, and this is out of a score of 12. Um, and then tier 2 is like 9 to 10.5, and then it goes like that all the way down to tier 5, which are countries that are probably not doing that well on our metrics. So as we can see, like across the world, there's a fair bit of distribution. We see that a fair bit of the EU is in the tier 2 category. We see a lot of the Latin American countries have been boosting their AI policy action. We notably have seen a jump by the US very recently because the AI executive order and a lot of action has been happening within the United States in terms of like Senate hearings. And I'll provide a much more a regional overview towards the end as well. So this is again an overview of each country broken down by how they performed across each questions. So as I was talking earlier, you can see that long list of yellow, which is a partial marking, or red is a no, which is essentially a 0, and greens are obviously 1. So the country satisfied that criteria for the question. You can see that Canada has been like doing pretty well. Our past report had them at 11.5, and they have maintained that score. The long list of yellows you see is because of countries endorsing the OECD AI ethics, which is question 1, but not having proper frameworks to implement it, or not proper guidelines to recommend it to implement it. Which is why like a lot of countries have this kind of very middle of the road. Maybe they have like relatively vague mentions of it in their AI strategies, in recent AI legislations, and the Greens are like have much more solid, robust laws mandating AI, mandating like government agencies to adhere to the OECD AI principles, and potentially even in Canada's case, particularly having a very specific roadmap and timeline of hitting all of those check marks which the OECD AI principles mandates. So this is like the global distribution, and you can see that question 12 is has a lot of yellows and reds. At least primarily that is due to the recent resolution which was adopted in 2023, which some countries are still um, giving the benefit of doubt. They are relatively slow to do that. A lot of those countries have partial marks because they have um, endorsed the ones in 2022, 20, and 19 and 18, which have been previous GPAI resolutions. So yeah, that's the overview on this block. And coming from that, what are our sort of key takeaways? And credit for this analysis goes to Grace Thompson, who is our senior research fellow at the Center for AI and Digital Policy. Many countries have ended up, improving their score, namely 45, and I believe there's 80 countries on the report right now. There's country scores are extremely high for endorsement, as we can see. Questions 1, I believe 10, and even question 3. So those are like the ones pertaining to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, OECD AI principles, and the UNESCO AI recommendations. They are very high on endorsement, but they are very low for implementation, and that is a key takeaway. That we see a lot of movement happening in the AI policy space. All of these countries, ministers going in tuxedos to AI safety summits across the world and talking about concerns about AI. But when it actually comes down to implementing, we see relatively less action. To their credit, some of these resolutions or recommendations are relatively recent, and they might be still responding to the whole game changer which ChatGPT has been. But yeah, as it stands right now, we see relatively less degree of engagement in terms of implementations and actually having the policy roadmaps being fleshed out on a national level. We also see like one of our key metrics actually is public participation, and whether countries have been inviting public comments on their regulation. Specifically, have they set up AI advisory boards? Have they, on every piece of legislation, have they invited civil society organizations and just other stakeholders to provide input? And countries like Canada, again, really have taken an aggressive lead with this, because they've set up an entire advisory board mechanism, which puts out and has mandated, I think, like putting out draft legislations within a certain time frame to give like people ample amount of opportunity to read it, assess it, and give any inputs they might. And the inclusion of like key principles such as fairness, accountability, transparency has also been generally on the rise across policy legislations we have seen, or across like comments made at international forums like the United Nations. So yeah, that is a set of sort of key takeaways. And there's this general kind of feeling. This was a meme which was, I believe, retweeted by Elon Musk before on the AI safety summits, that everyone, all the countries seem to be saying, oh, AI has huge degree of risk. And at the same time, they have the very same countries, the very same people, the very same bodies have relatively aggressive strategies towards developing AI and being like among the first movers in the space. So yeah, again, performance per tier and the regions, we see that a lot of countries have improved their positions. You've seen across the board, countries have improved their ratings on our metrics. And this is just a general breakdown of where each country stands across like the different tiers and in the different regions. So again, this is like, we are very strong on endorsing, and we see those spikes in questions 1, 3, and 10. But that being said, there's a lot of work to be done in terms of implementation, in terms of endorsement of the GPAI resolutions, because you see there's no spikes near question 12, which is also an endorsement recommendation. And yeah, there's some movement compared to 2022, the 22 report on there being independent oversight within whatever data protection authorities these governments make within the requirements for algorithmic transparency or public participation, as I was talking about earlier. So yeah, that's where we stand, and we see that there's a lot of engagement coming from the Latin American countries and the Middle East in forums conducted by the UNESCO bodies. Yeah. So here's a set of relatively quick regional highlights. The African Union has put out a continental strategy for AI development, which, by the way, I believe is still up for public comments up till the end of May. So if anyone wants to, give comments on their rather extensive framework, that would be pretty cool. And quite a lot of countries have participated in things like the AI Safety Summit, and Kenya has been one of the um, leaders in the general AU space. They also had a ruling which banned WorldCoin, which is, for those who don't know, WorldCoin is this cryptocurrency startup, which I believe Sam Altman is also one of the investors in, which scans your iris. And the idea is like universal basic income to be distributed through that unique hash, which is generated by scanning your iris, because everyone has a unique iris, kind of like an iris print. And one of the courts in Kenya basically struck the entire operations of WorldCoin down, because they said that that goes against, how biometric data is collected in our countries. And Kenya is also like active in making a very specific implementation mechanism or an assessment methodology for the in response to the UNESCO AI recommendations. A lot of the Latin American countries have been very active. I talked about the Colombian Data Protection Authority earlier. A bunch of the Caribbean countries and a bunch of the Latin American countries have also got together to create a framework for a joint regulatory sandbox, and something also called a regulatory beach, which is like a regulatory sandbox which allows like multiple stakeholders to come and toy with a model with relaxed requirements in legislation, and just see basically stress test the models and how they behave. Yeah, so there's also like an Ibero-American network which is coming up for the protection of personal data, and a bunch of these countries have gotten together and made a regional council off of the back of the Santiago Declaration I was talking about earlier. And in the Middle East, we have seen that a couple of countries have become a part of BRICS most prominently recently, and there's an AI study groups which is coming up under BRICS, which these countries have been looking to be contributing more and more to. And across Europe, we see quite a lot of activity, which also like is a lot of where a lot of eyes are turning towards when you come in the AI policy space. Recently, the EU AI Act was adopted. The Council of Europe's framework, which is like the world's first international AI treaty, was also adopted. UK is obviously hosted the AI Safety Summit, and a couple of other countries have been launching like investigations into OpenAI, and have been just generally trying to operationalize and set up Ministry of Technology's arms, so like more specific bodies to comply with the EU AI Act, and just mandate risk assessment methodologies, flesh out how the Digital Services Act will interact with the EU AI Act's risk-based approach. So that's been what's mostly going on in all of Europe. There's also Mistral, which is coming up which is a French-based startup, which a bunch of OpenAI engineers, previous OpenAI engineers made, which has been criticized for lobbying the French and German governments, and a little bit on that later. And yeah, across Asia, we see India recently launched an advisory to the cabinet, which deals with technology, which is relatively vague and pretty quickly criticized by a lot of the startup ecosystem in India. And there's the Ministry of the Minister of Electronics, Information and IT actually rolled that advisory back, and said that we'll probably come up with something more specific and more fleshed out in July, after the elections are done and the new prime minister is sworn in. So we also see, Asia also hosted the South Korean Seoul AI Safety Summit very recently, and China has been trying to influence a lot of BRI nations into developing shared standards potentially. And we see some action happening in Oceania as well, with Australia, especially like Australia trying to develop or push for like some sort of AI dialogues within the framework of the Quad, which is India, um, joined by Japan, Australia, and the US. And they've been having some sort of public consultations in safe and responsible AI, and they also launched, I believe, a draft framework on how AI is to be used in um, government bodies, within the Australian government's different kinds of agencies. So yeah, just I'll quickly just look at the chat. Otherwise, I wanted to talk a little bit about the instances of regulatory capture. And I believe there's quite a lot to be said here, which is also why I did not restrict myself to a lot of bullet points. One of them I kind of alluded to earlier was the EU AI Act, and I wish like people knew more about this or were talking more about this, because we are already seeing regulatory capture happen in real time, and and I believe like it's just not hitting the right people in the AI safety space to the right degree. So the EU AI, for one thing, was stalled for a really long time by the work of Mistral. They tried to make like different degrees of regulation, and then they ended up at least partly um, winning because they made this kind of very, very lax, wishy-washy language in the EU AI Act, which talks about these general providers of AI services, and they talk about another degree of risk for other companies, which very, very, and the kind of wording they have seems to only suggest that the stricter GPAI regulations will work on like Google and OpenAI, but they might not work on something like Mistral yet. And they have like wrestled quite a bit with the subcommittees within the EU, talking a lot about liability and trying to like get some sort of carve outs within the EU AI Act for European companies, because a lot of what the EU wants is also its own big tech giants. If you look at like any of the big tech giants, and almost pretty much everyone is American, and the EU has been wanting for quite some time to get its own set of relatively large technological companies. Yeah, so that is like at least part of the reason of like vague differences to GDPR or the DSA or the DMA within consultations held in the European Commission or the European Council when the EU AI Act was being discussed. And there's a lot of concern for how much Germany and France, German and French delegations are just willing to, you know, put up ultimatums in front of the remainder of the council. The other thing which I wanted to talk about, which I've really not seen too much of conversation on, is the Council of Europe's AI Treaty, which is set to become, which is basically passed and become the world's first international AI treaty, which has taken a primarily rights-based approach. The idea of it being international and still having the name Council of Europe, just to clear any confusion, is that even observer states can sign on to and ratify the treaty. It's particularly interesting because multiple NGOs have signed on to a letter, and the Center for AI and Digital Policy was also one of them, calling on the EU to, calling on the Council of Europe, which by the way is a separate institution from the EU. They very confusingly use similar names and very confusingly have like a very, very similar looking flag. The basic call was safeguard surveillance, the using of AI in some sort of social scoring, surveillance, and facial recognition systems. At some point in January earlier this year, one of the draft resolutions for the framework was also leaked, and it seemed to suggest that there would be carve-outs for public sector companies which are engaged in matters of AI pertaining to defense and matters of like something very carefully worded, like matters of national concern, and carve-outs for private sector AI companies, which really forces you to think a little bit about who exactly is remaining. to be covered by the treaty, which is supposed to be the first of its kind and supposed to, at its central core, protect human rights. What ended up happening is they had some sort of compromise, and every country can determine to what level, when ratifying, they have to state that up to what level the private sector regulations or like the private sector protections will come into force. This is relatively binding on countries because the European Court for Human Rights can arbitrate on it. Yeah, so it's pretty significant and it's pretty concerning. Just the general direction it has moved. Yeah, but there's still, like, obviously, countries which actually want to make an impact or make an effort, or they can ratify it by saying, we are using this framework and we are stating that all of these regulations or all of these frameworks can apply to private sector AI companies as well. So that was the two notable instances of like regulatory capture, and hopefully we won't see more of them. But my feeling is that this kind of cycle of lobbying prey predator cycle will continue. Yeah, so quickly moving on to the next slide, which is, yeah, I'm pretty much done, and I'm curious of what caught people's attention the most, because I've spoken quite expansively from like the Middle East to the Latin American countries to China, and like to like rants about the Council of Europe's AI treaty. Happy to like discuss more. I think this has been under 30 minutes. I don't have a timer with me, unfortunately. So yeah, I'm happy to chat more.
So if I understand the COE AI treaty, what you were saying is they put restrictions on who can collect surveillance data, but they excluded everyone who actually does this.
Something like that. They did have like, so I in no way want to say that that is the only thing that the treaty focused on. It focused on like other protection of like human rights across the entire spectrum of different kinds of human rights considerations or threat models. But yeah, that is a fair summarization of that.
That particular chunk of the treaty.
Yes. Yeah.
I don't know whether to be encouraged or exasperated.
Your pick. Oh, I see someone mentioned that there's like relatively there's no summits in Russia, but work is underway. I do think that there's a Russian AI strategy which was relatively prominent, and I think there's actually some amendments to that as well. If I can quickly pull it up in time. I mean, yeah, I also think that Russia has been pretty active in BRICS forums. I actually was at something called the World Youth Forum in Russia just a couple of months ago, and I talked to some people who worked at the BRICS AI Research Lab, and they seem to like also have these concerns about just how data is processed, think about how AI will affect society, focusing a little bit on interoperability and global standards. Yeah, the specific amendments I was talking about, which were, I believe, signed by the Russian president in February, was talking about rephrasing a lot of the definitions. I also remember them having like some sort of national AI website, which I will quickly share in case people are interested about that. Okay, this is, I think, the English version of the site. This is the relatively recent Russian amendments, and there's also like I don't want to take this on too much of a tangent. I'm also happy to do this in a one-on-one, but Sphere and Yandex are getting more and more aggressive because they want to, like, at least my personal, these are completely personal views, is that they want to capture more and more of the tech space in Russia, especially after major Western tech companies have left, and ChatGPT is also not available in Russia without a VPN. So they've been launching, Spare GPT and Yandex GPT. I've not seen too much activity from those companies or too many comments from them on matters of AI safety. But yeah, they have been like pretty aggressive on those instances. And there's like quite a lot of AI conferences happening at the Russian Academy of Sciences. I was at one of those two on an internship last year, and I think a lot of people shared concerns, but um, I'm again like not sure of specific plans of Russian lawmakers to do anything in the space to rail in uh, either the use of AI in autonomous weapon systems or the use of AI by like companies like this Bay Area and Yandex. Yeah. Yeah. Does anyone else have any more thoughts or questions, or just wants to chat about anything? I'm happy to do that, or we're also happy to call it a day.